UN climate envoy has urged countries to lift what he called tactical blockades at the COP climate summit in Dubai. With less than 24 hours to go, representatives from nearly 200 countries are struggling to find a consensus on a deal to prevent the worst effects of climate breakdown. Some countries are calling for fossil fuels to be phased out altogether. We look at whether it would be feasible to stop using coal, gas and oil to power our economies.
A city built on oil and the United Arab Emirates venue for the world's biggest climate conference to date. A contradiction in terms and the centre for negotiations over whether burning fossil fuels for energy should be reduced but continue, or whether they should be abandoned altogether.
And what's also clear from the science is we're not going to be able to curtail climate impacts unless we get a fossil fuel phase out. It needs to be fair, it needs to be funded, but we need it right here, right now at this COP.
But the question remains over whether it's practically and economically possible. Oil, gas and coal continue to provide around 80% of the world's energy. And large polluting industries like steel, cement and long-haul aviation still rely heavily on fossil fuels. Experts say there are alternatives.
It's economically possible to have a complete phase out of fossil fuels because we can have an energy system and an economy based on renewable energy, based on energy efficiency, and based on alternatives to fossil fuel.
Global investment in clean energy has risen over the past few years from just over 1.2 trillion in 2019, forecast to hit around 1.7 trillion this year. But it will need to reach an estimated 4.5 trillion by 2030 for a hope of reaching net zero targets 2 decades later, according to the International Energy Agency.
We do have scenarios, pathways that get us there. However, they require efforts in investments, efforts in R&D, and efforts in policies that so far have failed to materialize.
In this desert paradise, not all countries are on board for a completely fossil fuel-free future. Oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia, for example, are reluctant to lose the substance that has made them wealthy. As the global climate conference draws to an end, activists in Dubai are calling on leaders to make a choice: to end humanity's dependence on burning fossil fuels and stride quickly towards a clean energy future.
Well, joining us now from the climate conference in Dubai is our political correspondent, Giulia Saudelli. Giulia, the conference is in its final stages. Are negotiators getting any closer to an agreement?
Well, they are working very hard at it from what we're hearing, but the situation is still wide open. And also, as we've heard from the report, there are indications that fossil fuel phase out is the big topic at the COP this year. And we know from science that to try to keep at bay the worst consequences of climate change, the world has to rapidly and substantially stop emitting CO2. And the main cause of CO2 emissions is the burning of fossil fuels, so coal, oil and gas. And we've seen, especially from the small island nations and from developing countries, those who are most affected by global warming, a push to get the phase out of all fossil fuels into an agreement here at COP. We've also seen this year, and it would be the first year that fossil fuels are mentioned in a COP agreement, all of them, and not just coal. We've seen that also developed and industrialized countries have been building momentum in this direction. Also countries that are also fossil fuel producers like Canada and Australia. But the European Union is also a great promoter of having a fossil fuel phase out in the agreement. And we've heard this coming also from the EU's Commissioner for Climate Action. Let's have a listen to what he said.
If we put more stuff into the air, the planet will boil. And that is what we're here to prevent. And therefore we can have a compromise, and we should have a compromise on how we're going to do that and how we're going to divide the measurements. But we cannot argue with the 1.5. We cannot argue with the need to phase out fossil ASAP.
So clear words there from the EU's top negotiator. What kind of opposition, Giulia, is there to a fossil fuel phase out?
Well, there seems to be quite some opposition. We've seen that OPEC, the cartel of oil producing countries, last week put out a letter asking members of the group not to vote in favor of any deal that includes a mention to a fossil fuel phase out. And we've heard from media reports, but also talking to people here at COP, that especially Saudi Arabia is strongly pushing back in negotiations against a mention of fossil fuel phase out. This is one of the biggest oil producing countries. Its economy is strongly reliant on fossil fuels, and it seems like they're using tactics, stalling negotiations, really trying hard to not reach an agreement. And we have to keep in mind, agreements here at COP are reached by consensus. All countries have to be unanimously in agreement to sign a deal. So Saudi Arabia could actually block any agreement on a fossil fuel phase out, and this is something that the big coalition of countries in favor of one are really trying to avoid.
Giulia, thank you very much. That was our correspondent, Giulia Saudelli, in Dubai.